There are hundreds of small farming villages in Ukraine that were invaded and occupied by the Russians. This is the story of just one of them. Bogdanivka, on the road north out of Kyiv. Alexander has hidden the clothes he was wearing on the night the Russians came for him. He's keeping them safe as evidence of war crimes. He shows us the blood on his tracksuit bottoms where a nail was hammered into his knee, and the fabric that was used to tie his hands behind his back. He has scars on his face where he was burnt with cigarettes. He doesn't want us to identify him because he's scared that the Russians might return.
Тоді знову б'є.
A soldier put my hands on the table and hit them 3 times with the butt of a machine gun. My arm was badly bent and broken, Alexander tells us. He kept on saying, "You're a Nazi, you're a Nazi." They hit me so hard on my head I heard something crack. There was so much blood on the floor that a soldier slipped in it. My nose was broken. Then they threatened to cut my tendons and kill me. Nearby is the house where they tortured Alexander and others, in a room up on the first floor, he tells us. It is just a few doors down from the village school, well, what's left of it now. This became the main Russian base when they occupied the village. Every single room has evidence of rampant depravity.
Там в кінці туалет, але туди стидно мені вас вести.
As a final insult, they smeared their own excrement on the walls and then firebombed the places they retreated.
Те, що вони зробили, це просто жахливо. Було важко і мені, було важко дітям, і знаю, що плакали діти. Діти з садочка 5-річні, які бачили оце все, бачили, як садочок згорів, і він взагалі там зірвався. Вони просто плакали.
The Russian soldiers went house to house through the village, marking front gates if people lived inside. Like everyone, Yulia Vasilenko got a knock on the door. She's married to the village policeman, Vyacheslav. He was taken away that day, and he hasn't been seen since.
Надіюся, що він в полоні, хоч якось, але нам він живий треба, потрібен він живий. Ніхто нічого про нього не чув, ніхто нічого не бачив, тому що всі налякані сиділи, всі по домах отак сиділи налякані.
These are the stories of just one Ukrainian village. Men, women and children whose lives and futures have been irrevocably changed and damaged during 100 days of war. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News in Ukraine.
O God, whom I praise, do not remain silent, for wicked and deceitful men have opened their mouths against me. They have spoken against me with lying tongues. With words of hatred they surround me, they attack me without cause. In return for my friendship they accuse me, but I'm a man of prayer. They repay me evil for good and hatred for my friendship. Appoint an evil man to oppose him. Let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is tried, let him be found guilty, and may his prayers condemn him. May his days be few, may another take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. May his children be wandering beggars. May they be driven from their ruined homes. May a predator seize all he has. May strangers plunder the fruits of his labour. May no one extend kindness to him or take pity on his fatherless children. May his descendants be cut off, their names blotted out from the next generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord. May the sin of his mother never be blotted out. May their sins always remain before the Lord, that he may cut off the memory of them from the earth. For he never thought of doing a kindness, but hounded to death the poor and the needy and the brokenhearted. He loved to pronounce a curse, may it come upon him. He found no pleasure in blessing, may it be far from him. He wore cursing as his garment. It entered into his body like water, into his bones like oil. May it be like a cloak wrapped about him, like a belt tied forever around him. May this be the Lord's payment to my accusers, to those who speak evil of me. But you, O sovereign Lord, deal well with me for your name's sake. Out of the goodness of your love, deliver me. For I am poor and needy, and my heart is wounded within me. Faded away like an evening shadow, I'm shaken off like a locust. My knees give way from fasting, my body is thin and gaunt, an object of scorn to my accusers. When they see me, they shake their heads. Help me, O Lord my God. Save me in accordance with your love. Let them know it's your hand, that you, O Lord, have done it. They may curse, but you will bless. When they attack, they'll be put to shame, but your servant will rejoice. My accusers will be clothed in disgrace and wrapped in shame as in a cloak. With my mouth I'll greatly extol the Lord. In the great throng I'll praise him. For he stands at the right hand of the needy one, to save his life from those who condemn him. Psalm 109. Who can ever remember hearing a sermon on this psalm? No, you probably haven't before. You might not hear another one either. We tend to ignore these psalms. They're called imprecatory psalms. Imprecatory. They're prayers of judgment, for God's judgment on someone's enemies. Psalm 7, there's quite a few of them. Psalm 7 is the mildest sort of one. Psalm 109, the one I've just read, is getting close to the worst. Psalm 137 tops them all. Happy is the one who takes your babies and smashes them against the rocks. That's at the top end. Psalm 109, that's pretty bad. He wants his children to be fatherless and his wife to be a widow. He wants this guy's children to be wandering beggars and creditors to seize all they have. What do you do with this stuff? We're nice Christians. This here seems vengeful and cruel. What do we do with these? Before I answer that question, I need to do a couple of technical asides. I'm actually using the NIV for this. I normally preach, as you know, from the NLT. Some translations, like the NLT and the Good News, put all that horrible stuff in the middle of Psalm 109 in quotes. So they, by doing that, they're saying that this is what the bad guys are saying about David. Okay. Now the NIV doesn't do that. It puts that as an alternative translation, and there's all these technical arguments about which is the correct way to interpret it. And to be honest, I don't know the answer. It's above my pay grade. But I'm using the NIV version as it's given, as we've just read, because there are heaps of other psalms that say similar things, and they don't have this option of this alternative translation. It's only Psalm 109 that seems to have this technical debate in the Hebrew about which way around it is. So the reason I'm using that is because, as I said, there are heaps of other psalms that express very similar sort of sentiment. So that's a technical aside. Technical aside number 2 is that this is quoted, Psalm 109 is quoted in the New Testament as referring to the need to replace Judas in Acts chapter 1, verse 20. All right, so that's the technical stuff out of the way. David, who supposedly wrote this, is being falsely accused by an evil person or people, we're not sure, either a person or a group of people. And there's these seriously false allegations being made against him. And possibly when he was very sick, or maybe because he got sick as a result of the serious allegations. It says, verse 24, he was thin, frail, and object of scorn. Clearly, he is suffering. We just had this week in the news, Peter Ellis, whose convictions were quashed after 20-something years. He spent in prison, falsely accused. It's hard to imagine what that would be like to be in prison for such a long time for something you knew that you didn't do. That would be, it's just hard to imagine how we would react to that. But it's pretty clear in the psalm that the anger and the frustration oozes out of it. I mean, he is incredibly angry. And he wants his accusers to suffer. So I want to make 3 observations about this psalm. The first is that it's normal to be angry. Right? It's normal to be angry, especially when it's an injustice against ourselves, when we're ripped off. You know, we feel angry, and rightly so. Anger comes when a boundary is broken. You know, when someone burgles us, when someone breaks a promise, we feel angry. So a boundary has been broken. Boundaries are normal and natural. We set boundaries all the time. Please don't come into my room without knocking. It's a boundary. So we're able to set boundaries around ourselves. And if people break our boundaries, we'll feel angry about that. God also sets boundaries. He says don't have sex outside of marriage. It's a boundary. It's very commonly ignored boundary today, but God sets boundaries. God is upset when his boundaries are broken. We get angry when we're sinned against, when our boundaries are broken. Often, though, we don't get angry at the things that God gets angry about. You know, we tend to let stuff wash over us. You know, we don't feel outraged when, we hear that some country, that the government has murdered 50 people, or, we don't get stirred by the fact that 2 million women in the world each year are kidnapped for the sex trade every year. That doesn't tend to make us angry. William Wilberforce got angry at the injustice of slavery, and that anger drove him to do something about it. Jesus got angry at the money changers in the temple because they were ripping off poor people and hindering them from relating to God. In fact, if you read the Old Testament prophets come across as incredibly angry. They're angry at injustice and poverty. Now, I personally don't feel that comfortable with anger. I think I got the message as a child that anger was something bad. I used to have a really bad temper when I was young, and I think I was taught and learned that anger was bad, and came to see anger as something to be suppressed. So today it takes me a long time to figure out if I'm angry. Someone says something or does something to me, and the next day I think, I might be angry about that. So it's quite a delay between the two. But I think we've become immune to injustice and evil. We see it all the time on TV, but it has very little impact on us. You know, we know that all these injustices happen in the world, and we just accept it as reality. So we're quite passive to these kind of things. Happens somewhere else to someone else. And we are, in New Zealand, generally, 99% of the time, incredibly sheltered from evil. I deliberately showed you the Ukraine video, and trust me, that's a mild version of some of the atrocities happening over there. But we don't experience evil. There is bad things that happen, and there's also evil. And, we hear of some 90-year-old woman being raped, and we think it's just evil. Or some innocent person tortured or shot at random. But very rarely do we personally come face to face with evil. So I deliberately show that shot of Ukraine because it gives some context to the psalm. Because I think most of us would feel incredible anger if we were confronted and experiencing that kind of evil. Many people in the world are living with that kind of evil day on. If we wake up one morning to gunshots and see your family shot and raped in front of you, we're face to face with evil. People of Burma have their villages burnt to the ground and their children abducted. They live with evil day in, day out. Most of us are not sure how we'd react, let alone just once, to that kind of evil, let alone it happen time and time again. I get worried when I see on TV someone who has lost a loved one due to some evil act, and they quickly pronounce forgiveness on the offender. I'm not worried that they choose to forgive. I'm worried because I think a more natural response initially is one of anger. Forgiveness can only come once we've processed our anger and the pain that we feel. That's my first comment about the psalm. The second comment I'd make about the psalm is that he directs his anger to God. He doesn't bottle it up. He doesn't say, I shouldn't think thoughts like this. Sometimes I say that to myself, I shouldn't feel that. Trouble is, if we say I shouldn't feel that, it sets up a gap between your head, says I shouldn't feel that, and your heart. And so what it's saying to your feelings is you're not legitimate. You should not be there, go away. But if you do that, you set up a tension between your head and your heart. That causes problems. And he doesn't withdraw from God. A typical response in the face of bad stuff happening is often we withdraw. We refuse to talk to God. Maybe because deep down we blame God for it. We're angry at God. Bad stuff happens, we blame God. How could God allow this to happen? How could he let my child suffer? How could he let me lose my job? How could God allow this evil to happen to me? And so we withdraw. We separate from God. The psalmist doesn't separate from God. He directs his anger at God as a statement of faith, because he's saying in praying this prayer and these horrible things that happen to his enemy, God, I'm going to trust that you're going to fix it, that you're a God of justice, that you won't allow injustice to go unpunished. So he starts off verse 1, O God whom I praise. Verse 36 at the end, so sandwiched in the middle is all this horrible stuff. But at the end he says, with my mouth I'll greatly extol the Lord, in the throng I will praise him. For he stands at the right hand of the needy one to save his life from those who condemn him. Now we have the advantage because we're looking from a New Testament perspective. And for the Jews in the Old Testament, they didn't really have much of an idea of what happened after death. It was all very vague about that. But we know that one day Jesus will return. We know that justice will be done. The Old Testament writer didn't know that. We know that we live in this era of grace. Just reading about that I'll be reading through John. We're living in an era of grace. Jesus said, I'm not going to condemn. But there is going to be a day of judgment. Hebrews 4 says, one day, 6 says, we'll all one day die and face judgment. God will not allow evil to go unpunished. Sometimes people object to the idea of hell, of a separation from God. They object to the idea of judgment. But actually we have this deep desire within us to see justice. Jesus in his parables, a huge number of his parables, talk about judgment. So the fact is he directs his anger at God is very positive. He expresses it, he's honest about how he's feeling, and he realizes that God ultimately has the power to bring about justice. That in itself is a prayer of faith. The third comment I'd make about the psalm is that anger is not an excuse to sin. David, of all people, if you read his life story, acted out this commandment to love our enemies. Some say this is a New Testament idea, that Jesus sort of made up this new teaching to love our enemies. But if you read the Old Testament, that's not true. Leviticus 19:17 says, do not hate your brother in your heart. Don't seek revenge or bear a grudge. Proverbs 25:24, if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he's thirsty, give him water. Does that sound familiar? Both Paul and Jesus taught this. So if you remember David's life, he was a young lad. He killed Goliath. He was anointed by Samuel to be king. But he was hunted by Saul for years. Even though he'd done nothing wrong, he was hunted by the state for years and years. And it meant he had to hide in caves and sleep in terrible places. And sometimes he had to actually go over to across and to live with his enemies. And at least twice he had opportunity to kill Saul. And he doesn't. He had every justification to kill Saul, but he doesn't. Even after Saul dies, he shows kindness to Saul's family. When Absalom, his son, rebels and tries to take the throne, he refuses to retaliate. Jesus says we're to love our enemies, so our anger is not an excuse to sin. Love is not some fuzzy feeling, it's an action. It's what we do, it's not what we feel. And we are to forgive. It means we let go the right to seek retribution, to get even. And we might think, I can't get justice. There's no justice in the courts. The courts let them off or whatever. And you see that often when you see people responding to sentencing. Well, there's no justice. No one has seen the damage they've done. So I'm going to get justice myself. I will hurt them. I'll hold on to my bitterness. I'll punish them. And in reality, of course, we hurt ourselves, not them. We have to trust. Forgiveness is, in the end, an act of trust that we will trust that God will bring justice, that he knows what the person has done and he will sort it out. But of course, when we're angry, it's very easy to justify our sin because we've been sinned against. And so I'm justified in being bitter, or I'm justified in gossiping, or I'm justified in my self-pity. But Paul says, in your anger, do not sin. So I have some questions about this psalm for you to consider this morning. What do you get angry about? What do you get angry about? We tend to get angry about the things that are important to us. I often get angry at myself, actually. When I make a mistake or I don't live up to my own standards, I'm getting better at this. But I don't get angry at the slave trade in the world. Well, not angry enough to motivate me to do anything. Now, I suspect that God is not nearly as angry at me as I get. I suspect God is very angry at the slave trade in the world. So there's something I've not grasped about God's character and who he is that I've got that round the wrong way. So what do you get angry about? And what does that tell you? Second question is, what do you do with your anger? Do you express it? Are you honest with what's going on in your heart to God? Do you really believe that God can bring justice to your situation? Because suppressed anger shows itself in all kinds of ways, in passive-aggressive sort of comments. Or we get even in the little things. We feel irritable all the time, or it physically affects us with headaches and ulcers and high blood pressure, or we try and escape the feeling of anger with alcohol or drugs or whatever. And we use that anger, suppressed anger, as an excuse for bad choices. I deserve some happiness after all the pain of my life, so I'll go and have an affair. Or we're cynical. Often people are really cynical. There's a deep anger underneath. Or we get very legalistic. It's interesting, people that are politicians and ministers who get really angry about moral issues. It's really interesting because the history of politicians and ministers who fall into sin, you'll often find they've been very angry. They've railed from the pulpit about immorality, or politicians around values, declining, whatever. Actually, what they're doing is they're projecting their own anger at themselves onto others. They're angry at their own brokenness. And so if you hear me getting angry about moral decay, you probably should worry. But yeah, it's actually suppressed anger in people. So what are you doing with your anger? And the third thing to ask is this: is there sin in your life at the moment that you're justifying because you're hurt? Is there unforgiveness or bitterness or self-pity? And if there is, Jesus says, actually get the log out of your own eye first. Deal with your own sin rather than worrying about the other person's, because you ultimately are responsible for you. So as we come to communion this morning, this would encourage you to reflect on these questions. Is there a rift between you and God? Have you withdrawn from God? Take the time this morning to be honest with God. If you're angry at him, tell him. There's actually some paper and pens, and as we come forward to communion, if you want to write something down that you feel angry about, that you're grappling with, then write it down and bring it to the cross. And as you do, and as you bring it to the cross, think about the unfairness of the cross, the injustice of the cross, the suffering of the cross as you bring your anger there. Take time to listen to whether in your anger you've hung on to your own sin and it's hindering your own forgiveness. Because when we take communion, the bread and the drink in communion, we're acknowledging Jesus' death on the cross, which was an act of utter evil, that an innocent person was tortured. We're remembering an act of utter evil, but that Jesus chose willingly to do it for us. And when we drink the drink, we're acknowledging a new covenant. And the new covenant is a new covenant between us and God, where God says, if you believe in my Son, and you put your faith in Jesus Christ and follow him, then actually I will remove every wrongdoing that you've done, and you can come and you can be a child of mine. It's an incredible new covenant, because actually it simply requires that we take a step of faith. And maybe you want to do that today. You want to say, I want to commit my life to Jesus Christ. I want to be part of his family. And you can do that simply by saying, Jesus, I acknowledge who you are. I commit my life to following you. We can be part of this new covenant. The team are going to come. And you're just going to remain seated, and we're just going to sing quietly a song, which will come to me in a second. Here's my heart, that's right. Here's my heart. So just remain seated. This is really a prayer, asking God to speak, asking God to reveal what's in our heart, asking God to minister. And then after the song, some of our young people are going to be up the front and just serving your communion. But just take your time after the song is sung. Let's be a time of silence. Just take the time to meditate and reflect what's in your heart. And then when you're ready, you can come forward, you can write and go to the cross. You can come and take the bread and the drink and take it back to your seats. God, I pray by your Spirit you'd minister today into the deep places of our heart, into the hidden places. God, that this would be a safe space for us to be real and honest. In Jesus' name, amen.